Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Nature Conservancy's report, Accelerating Adaptation, Exploring the Promise and Limitations of Nature-Based Solutions for Droughts and Floods, and for a lively discussion among some of our TNC colleagues and two of our partners on this topic from the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and the International Water Management Institute. My name is Kari Viggerstall, and I'm the Director of Science for our water security work at the Nature Conservancy. We are really looking forward to engaging with you all attending today and welcome your questions throughout the event. And let me share our agenda for today. After I conclude some additional introductory remarks, my colleague Nathan Karras will present an overview of the report, including key figures and messages. Then we'll hear from our colleague Kirsten Watson, who will present one of the 8 case studies included in this report. After Kirsten's presentation, we've set aside time for attendees to ask questions about the report and case study. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll do our best to bring as many questions as we can forward during this time, as well as answer questions via the chat throughout the webinar. Then we'll move on to hear different perspectives on the role of nature in adaptation and insights into efforts from UNCCD and IMI, followed by a panel made up of all the speakers. We do have questions prepared for this panel, but we really love to hear from all of you what you are interested to learn more about. So keep those questions coming. And finally, as we near the end of our time together, I will close out the webinar with some reflections and a couple of exciting announcements. So as I mentioned, we've got some great opportunities for audience interaction, so please do use that Q&A function and bring your questions to us throughout the webinar. I am honored to introduce our esteemed group of speakers today, which includes Nathan Karras, who's a senior freshwater scientist at the Nature Conservancy, Kirsten Watson, who is the Greater Cape Town Water Fund Manager for TNC South Africa, Daniel Sagai, who's a program officer at the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and Matthew McCartney, who is a research group leader with Sustainable Water Infrastructure and Ecosystems at the International Water Management Institute. Before I hand off to Nathan, I just wanted to give some thank you to all of those who made this report possible. From the TNC project team, which includes, in addition to Nathan and I, Shatang Kang, Nancy Lilly, and Marika Massey-Bierman. And from the AMP Insights team, who are responsible for the case studies, including Amy McCoy and Sarah Cruz. And a special thank you to all of those partners who shared their stories with us as part of the case study collection in this report. Those partners include University of California, TNC California, Forest Trends, along with our TNC Peru team, the Stroud District Council in the UK, GIZ Zambia, Water for People, and TNC South Africa. And a big thank you to our funders who made this report possible, which include Enterprise Mobility Foundation and the Shockwave Foundation. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand off to Nathan to share about the report, to give you some highlights and key messages from the report. And I'll be back with you for the question and answer session after Kirsten's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. So Accelerating Adaptation was developed to support the Nature Conservancy's efforts to restore health and resiliency of our watersheds, and it forms a foundational document to support our work around the Resilient Watershed Strategy. So my presentation today is just going to provide a brief overview of this report that is nearly 100 pages in length, so apologies for going quickly through this content, but as I go through some of the key messages and key figures of the report, I do encourage you to follow up with a full report for any particular work and particular points of interest that are relevant to your own work. So why this report? So as many of you on this call know, I'm sure, water-related hazards like flood and drought are some of the most damaging natural disasters, affecting billions of lives and accounting for hundreds of billions in economic losses. There are impacts from floods that we've observed that they've declined over the last several decades due to progress made in reducing exposure and vulnerability to these hazards. But climate change threatens to reverse this trend with increasing frequency, intensity, and distribution of floods. We know that nature-based solutions generally can play a role in mitigating water-related impacts, including those from climate change, but the synergies, trade-offs, and potential magnitude of these impacts of NbS on flood and drought remain in part poorly described and poorly communicated. So that's part of the why of this report. And what does this report bring? We begin this project with a review of the many existing reports and documents that describe the space, including ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem disaster risk reduction. And in doing so, we observed two critical gaps. So the first is that we did not identify a report that specifically focused on adaptation for freshwater resources in particular. We also observed a lack of depth in describing and evaluating the potential for NbS activities to support adaptation. So in this report, we build on these prior efforts, the extensive available academic literature, to help us move from this conceptual discussion of NbS, ideally and hopefully towards more actively integrating NbS within global efforts for climate adaptation. So we begin the main body of our report with a brief review of our current understanding of flood and drought risk and how climate change is expected to drive changes in these risks. Beginning with flood hazards, as noted, the global extent of flood impacts is significant. Floods are the most prevalent natural disaster globally. Within this report, we focus primarily on river flood risks, that is otherwise known as fluvial flooding. So at the top map here in the figure, you can see the cumulative inundation extent for a 100-year flood event or a large flood event over the recent historical period, roughly from 1980 to 2013. The map illustrates, quite obviously, just visually looking at the coverage of the blue, that large-scale flood events are widespread globally, particularly within economically vulnerable areas of Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. There are more than 1.8 billion people, that's equivalent to roughly 1/5 of the current global population, that are estimated to have experienced large flood events over the last 20 years. Also significant are flood damages within that same period reaching on the order of 650 billion US dollars. So the current impacts of flooding are immense. The bottom map here indicates the extent of areas expected to face increasing river flood risk as a result of climate change. What is shown here, it represents the consensus assessments from the IPCC Working Group 1. There's various different information sources one could use, but this provides a robust consensus-based perspective using a whole variety of information sources, including models, current conditions, trends, other projections. And so from this data, we observe that there were projected to be increases in flood hazard that coincide with many of the areas already facing elevated risks of flood. So an even wetter future is likely for many regions of the world, including Central Europe, Eastern US, Central South America, and most of Asia Pacific. And all of these regions are then therefore expected to face increased river flood hazard as a result of climate change. Drought is also a major natural hazard disaster globally. Between 1970 and 2019, drought was responsible for 650,000 deaths, or nearly a third of all disaster-related deaths. The top map here focuses specifically on agricultural drought hazard and exposure. Now we're focusing specifically on agricultural drought given one, the close connections and linkages to drought-related impacts on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, and two, the potential support that NbS might provide to mitigate some of the impacts. So we see that this includes irrigated and rain-fed agricultural areas across the world that are exposed to drought, and there are high hazard areas including South Africa, Southern Africa, Mediterranean, Australia, much of the United States as well. Again, the bottom map presents that consensus assessment from the IPCC Working Group 1, these downscaled regional assessments. And here we see increased drought hazard expected throughout the Americas, potentially spanning large portions of North, South, and Central America. And there's also evidence for increased drought hazard for many parts of Europe, especially the Mediterranean. Many of these same areas are currently experiencing increased agricultural and ecological drought risks already today, such that climate change will further exacerbate these current risks for these places. So from that brief overview of current and future risk conditions, we then move into discussions of our current state of knowledge on how nature-based solutions can help reduce hazards, exposures, and vulnerability, the components of future risk for flood and drought. So we know generally that, as I've already said at the start, that nature-based solutions can play a role in mitigating some of the impacts from flood and drought. What we wanted to do in this report is really consider the specific drivers of nature-based solutions and how they affect these different hazards and what we might need to do in order to effectively design and implement nature-based solutions. So within our report, we tried to peel back some of these layers and some of this complexity of how NbS actually influence the processes behind flood and drought. The figure here identifies the major pathways by which nature-based solutions can reduce flood hazards, including influencing such processes as stabilizing soils to reduce soil loss, increasing infiltration, and reducing the kinds of rapid runoff that can drive floods. The figure also illustrates other processes which drive flood risk, such as precipitation patterns, soil type, the existing or endogenous basin characteristics, such as slope and topography. These are components which nature-based solutions cannot alter, thereby suggesting potential limits for which hazard reduction might be achieved through nature-based solutions. In our report, there's a lot of complexity shown in this figure, so in our report we try to use an example of forest restoration to help understand and walk the reader through some of these complexities. So forest restoration, in the idealized scenario, restores natural forest vegetation from degraded lands, which then leads to a whole diverse set of changes over different time scales and spatial scales. Initially, where non-forest vegetation is cleared and trees are planted, this can actually drive increases in runoff and erosion. Then after a period, trees become established, then we start to see some of those benefits of nature-based solutions that we talk about, increased local infiltration, canopy interception to reduce the erosive impact of rainfall. And in combination, these processes support a host of adaptation benefits such as increased base flow, groundwater recharge, improved soil health, and reduced erosion. However, other processes and impacts are also possible. Reforestation can also increase overall water demand and evaporative losses, where forest vegetation has greater water requirements than the vegetation that it is replacing. Trees also have deeper root systems that can potentially increase the flux or the transmission of water from deeper soil layers into the atmosphere. And so while forest restoration might support decreases in flood hazard, it can also exacerbate drought risk through increased plant water use. So this is the kind of complexity that we try to describe and pull out for the reader in this report. Yes, nature-based solutions can help communities adapt to changes in flood and drought, but it is critical to understand the specifics of these mechanisms, including where there are synergies, where there are trade-offs, as we've illustrated in part here. Similar to flood, we also present this illustrative diagram to describe the processes by which nature-based solutions can influence or mitigate impacts of drought. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this in detail. Again, I point the reader to the full report, which I think has been linked in the chat. I'll just highlight that we see some of the same mechanisms, the adaptive mechanisms that drought modulates. They're similar to the processes which are affected for flood as well, which I just presented, namely changes in soil structure with impacts on infiltration, changes in evapotranspiration or plant water use. And this overlap or these connections start to illustrate how some of these trade-offs might occur. So in addition to going through these process diagrams, these mechanistic diagrams, we also consider specific types of NbS and their potential contributions to flood and drought. So on the bottom left of the slide here, we present some of the major categories of nature-based solutions or types of nature-based solutions, including those related to the protection, the management, and restoration of landscapes. Shown here is just one example of these nature-based solutions, so I can walk through some of the attributes that we describe within each of these summaries. I'm just going to give a quick highlight. So given the close connection between flood and drought processes and how nature-based solutions can influence these, risk mitigation potential is described for both of these impacts here, so both flood and drought. We also consider the components of risk separately. So we include descriptions of how a particular nature-based solution can affect hazard components of risk, exposure components, and also vulnerability. At a very high level, we highlight some of the potential ecosystem-related co-benefits that might be supported through this nature-based solution type. And then we focus on hazard adaptation mechanisms more specifically, identifying those and indicating an appraisal of the directionality here with the plus and minus indicators. And this indicates areas of both uncertainty and also areas where context is critically important to understand whether you might be increasing or decreasing the adaptive benefits through employing a particular nature-based solution. This is particularly important for identifying those trade-offs. So having described the complexities of how nature-based solutions might support adaptation for flood and drought, we then turn our attention to what it might look like and what it might take to get to NbS adaptation implementation at scale. We begin, apologies for that. We begin with a high-level assessment to understand how areas of potential nature-based solution implementation overlap with areas of high flood and drought risk, both current and future risk combined. The point of this exercise is not to produce a global implementation scenario. We're not projecting or suggesting where and how to prioritize implementation of nature-based solutions. Rather, we are investigating and assessing the degree to which nature-based solutions actually coincide with areas of current and future hazard. In other words, where does this natural infrastructure sit on the landscape with respect to the locations of these hazards, in particular high hazard areas, including current and future risk? We look at this through three broad categories of nature-based solutions. The first being protection of intact landscapes or areas with low human modification. Then we also consider management of working landscapes such as cropland and pasture land. And then for restoration, we consider some of the most critical landscapes, floodplain areas in particular. And by overlaying these areas of nature-based solution, NbS or nature-based solution potential with these areas of high flood and drought risk, we see that more than a third of areas with NbS potential are situated within these areas of high flood or drought risk. So we see quite obviously global relevance of nature-based solutions for potentially mitigating these hazards. However, distribution is not uniform, and the relative proportion of different NbS categories differs between areas of flood and drought hazard. For example, many areas of currently low human influence, so those areas that would be good candidates for protection-related activities, include boreal forests in northern latitudes where human exposure to flood and drought is oftentimes relatively low. By contrast, a large proportion of areas suitable to management of activities for cropland and grazing lands or pasture land do overlap with areas of high drought risk. Looking regionally, NbS have widespread potential in areas of increased future flood hazard risk within China, India, Brazil, and the US. And areas within Southern Africa, Europe, Brazil, and the Western US exhibit both NbS potential and high future drought risk. So while we observe that nature-based solutions are globally relevant, as just discussed, with respect to future flood and drought areas, in order to get to such a global scale of implementation, funding is obviously a critical need. And a lack of funding is a challenge overall in the adaptation sector, such that less than 10% of all climate funding has gone towards adaptation in recent years. And according to the United Nations Environment Program, current spending on adaptation needs to increase by 3 to 7 times current spending before 2030 in order to meet climate adaptation needs of communities. In absolute terms, nature-based solutions are not a solution to this funding gap. Additional adaptation funding is simply a critical need. However, there's a multitude of co-benefits that can be achieved through NbS, and there's a potential to address multiple goals, including multiple global targets, such as 30 by 30 goals, and to meet these goals concurrently and thereby maximize the value of investments in adaptation. So mainstreaming NbS as an adaptation strategy can then therefore help maximize scarce resources and potentially unlock additional funding streams from sectors that are already supporting nature-based solutions, such as the water utility sector. Then a third perspective by which we consider questions of scale is through the lens of existing projects. So how have existing projects scaled NbS for adaptation and co-benefits? And what do these projects teach us about the applicability of NbS across different flood and drought adaptation contexts? So through the lens of 8 place-based projects around the world, In our report, we present case studies of how communities are already adapting to water-related climate impacts using NbS. And we're fortunate to have on the call today one of those case study, a presenter for one of those case studies, Kirsten Watson from Cape Town Water Fund, which she'll present shortly. Towards the end of our report, chapter 5, we then suggest some pathways forward for mainstreaming NbS as a globally relevant adaptation strategy for flood and drought. First, we summarize some of the key considerations identified and described in this report, some of which I've already pointed out. One which I have not discussed too much yet is the potential for climate change to affect the suitability and effectiveness of nature-based solutions themselves. This is one of the areas of growing need that we identified in this report to actually understand how climate is going to impact whether particular NbS are applicable and can be effectively employed in certain locations as we experience changes in temperature and precipitation patterns as a result of climate change. I've obviously talked about the importance of trade-offs, and it's worth emphasizing yet again how important these are and how critical they are for considering employing NbS for a particular location, for a particular set of hazards. Another key consideration is the importance of planning and implementing NbS in partnership with local communities. So not only are these communities stewards of these lands and waters and essential as participants in implementing NbS, but they also possess critical knowledge of climate risks and adaptation needs, as well as the suitability of particular NbS. Finally, we then close with a call to action to the nature-based solutions and adaptation communities. Again, I'll just summarize a few of these points that are presented on the slide here. The first and obvious need is something I've already discussed, and that's the need to rapidly increase investment in adaptation globally, including nature-based solutions. And as part of that, we need to ensure that nature-based solutions are embedded as a part of these investments. We also suggest that NbS be developed as part of an integrated solution to adaptation. So NbS alone is likely to be insufficient in most circumstances and needs to be part of an integrated approach to adaptation, including NbS, including other types of infrastructure and management solutions. There's also a critical need to strengthen the evidence base on the effectiveness of particular NbS for specific hazards. In this report, we've tried to move that conversation along in evolution, tried to summarize the current state of knowledge, but there are clear gaps in documenting the true magnitude and the levels of uncertainty in implementing and adopting NbS as part of a broader integrated adaptation set of solutions. In our final chapter of the report, we then provide detailed information on those case studies, which I already mentioned. And Kirsten Watson, who's the Water Fund Manager for Cape Town for South Africa, is going to present one of these examples in just a moment, but I also encourage you to review the full report to go through the other 7 case studies, which are also described and present different perspectives, different approaches, and different NbS solutions for different hazards as how they manifested in those particular locations. So I'll just conclude very quickly by reiterating our gratitude for the co-authors for this report, for my co-authors, including Kari Viggerstall, Shiteng Kong, Nancy Lilly, and Marika Massey-Bierman, and the numerous other individuals who have contributed to this, and as well, in particular appreciation to Shockwave Foundation and Enterprise Foundation, whose generous financial support made this report possible. With that, I'll close out my presentation and turn it over to Kirsten Watson, again, the Water Fund Manager for the Cape Town Water Fund. Thank you, Kirsten.
So I am very fortunate to present a successful nature-based solution here in South Africa called the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of what it's all about. So in 2018, the city of Cape Town experienced a severe drought. It was one of the worst droughts in almost 100 years, and 4 million people nearly ran out of water. We called this day 0 when the city ran out of water. And as you can see, thousands and millions of people were queuing up to get their daily 50 liters of water a day. The Western Cape, which is the area around Cape Town, is prone to drought droughts, specifically with changing climate and increasing temperatures. And this is going to become more severe and more unpredictable moving forward. And this image, you can see the stark difference as one of the key bulk storage areas in the city of Cape Town during 2018 in the peak of the drought versus 2022 when our dams could fill up again. And how do you adapt to this kind of environment where you're so vulnerable to the natural surroundings? One way is through a water fund to restore the catchments and ensure that your catchments are functioning the best that they can and giving water into your storage areas. The premise of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund is to cut down alien invasive trees, which are much more water hungry than the natural vegetation. And by doing this, we return water back into the streams. It was estimated that by chopping down water-hungry plants, you can increase stream flow by 24%. And with the business case, it was found that if you cleared the key priority catchments, you could reclaim 55 billion liters of water that's lost every year. This could supply the city of Cape Town with 2 months of water. This is really significant. And what the Greater Cape Town Water Fund is set out to do is to reclaim this water lost by the end of 2026. So how are we doing? Since the establishment in 2019, we've replenished 16.1 billion liters of water back into our catchments. If you look at this at a per day rate, we're restoring 44 million liters back into our systems. And this could supply 880,000 people with water for 50 liters per day. If you look at our progress based on our targets, we have initial clearing where people go out into the catchments and they do an initial treatment to clear the alien invasive plants. But then we have to keep going back again for the seedlings because there's still seed set in the mountains. So this is really a long-term project. We're looking at a 30-year horizon to clear all of these alien trees to get it to a functional state. In this process, we've also secured job opportunities, which is a big focus in South Africa especially, and building up skill sets. So 787 green job opportunities have been created. And you'll see by this quote from our social economic surveys how this has really impacted individual livelihoods, especially supporting them with increased technical skills like this rope access technician. If we look at the enabling factors, so we have a successful nature-based solution. So what were the enabling factors? There's 4 key ones I'd like to just quickly highlight. One is around the institutional and governance systems, setting up public-private partnerships where the city of Cape Town themselves are investing $9 million into the water fund, having collaborative planning and reporting systems, having diverse stakeholders from a social perspective brought in and building their job opportunities and skills, bringing in all the technical skills around the finding a solution with this nature-based solution, really bringing the science in to monitor what our impact is and progress over time. And lastly, economic, having diverse funding streams, using the most cost-effective approaches possible and sharing our resources between the partners. And as a whole, this has really enabled us to drive success and meet a lot of our high impact targets already. And moving forward, this is really an opportunity that the City of Cape Town and the partners that have been leading this work have taken advantage of a crisis and made it into a solution, especially if we're looking at drought resilience long term. And with that, I'll conclude this case study.
Great. Thank you so much, both Nathan and Kirsten, for your presentations. I see quite a few questions coming in the question and answer panel on Zoom. So we just have 5 minutes in this section of the webinar to answer a couple of questions. So we will do our best to bring the other questions forward to the panel and or answer in the Q&A chat. Just, I think a couple follow-up questions for you, Kirsten. There was a question on, is Cape Town replacing alien invasive trees with native species?
The catchments we work in have various degrees of invasion, from 100% invaded to very relatively low invasions, and they're surrounded by natural vegetation around it. And most of the sites, I would say 90% of our sites, restore naturally through seed dispersal from the natural vegetation, or they bounce back because you're removing the competition for space by removing the alien invasive plants. So you don't need active restoration, it's mostly passive. And then the few areas you need active, then you would have to look at alternative ways of restoring that.
Great. And I'll follow up with just a really quick question. Someone was interested in understanding the private partners that were involved, not the specific, but the type of private partners, type of industry that are involved in the water fund.
So we have the City of Cape Town, which is the city, a local municipality. We also have the provincial authority, which is responsible for the nature protection. So it's called Cape Nature. They are our two biggest partners in this space, but we also work with our departments of water and sanitation and national departments of environment in a more governance context rather than an implementation context.
Great, thank you for that. Nathan, turning over to you and looking at the questions we have here, quite a few great ones. I think I'll turn to Vanessa's question around South America. She was interested to learn why South America has less likely to have NbS opportunities for restoration. And I don't know if you can see that question there, but yeah.
Yeah, I can. And so again, just to go back to this, what is a rather, what we tended to be is a very straightforward and transparent overlay analysis and not to be inclusive of all opportunities related to nature-based solutions. So in particular on the restoration side, this is not something that's easily done in terms of identifying which areas are really truly restorable at a global scale. And in fact, we only looked at a very narrow segment of what are these potentially, and I think I mentioned in my presentation, these critical floodplain lands. And so we're only looking at floodplain areas, which are just necessarily globally in terms of spatial extent, just a small area. And so it is a relatively smaller proportion of the kind of nature-based solutions portfolio that we present, but that does not necessarily mean within your Latin American example that there aren't other opportunities for restoration. That's just what we're able to do at this large global scale. So that's part of the gaps that we have identified within the report. And so we definitely are hoping that there's other groups and other opportunities for us to further look into at a regional and even sub-regional scale where it's most appropriate to do this kind of planning work around adaptation, where we can actually look for broader sets of these NbS portfolios, including other restoration opportunities beyond floodplain restoration.
Great, thank you. With the minute left we have in this section, just wanted to pull forward a question that's coming from a couple of people around how do you consider the pros and cons of vegetation, considering, as we know, that evapotranspiration can reduce the availability of water at a given site. And someone else asked, is there a scientific study to decide those advantages and disadvantages? So can you just briefly, Nathan, mention how you might do that at a local level?
Yeah, maybe I can do that at a very high conceptual level, and maybe, Kirsten, if you have any comments to say on how you specifically have done that within the Cape Town Water Fund. And so this is part of the work that you really, again, you cannot do this kind of planning at a global or even a regional scale. This is done in a particular project in place where you have a clear understanding of the ecosystems, of the vegetation types within a given system. And so in order to get to that kind of decision making, you really need to have gone through what we presented very conceptually and broad. It's important to pull out those mechanisms, those conceptual mechanisms as we did in our diagram. We need to do that kind of exercise for a particular place and project and build through it in much more detail using local studies and evidence to help draw out what is the different kind of magnitudes of these different relationships between these processes, so you can actually understand and make some predictions around what the overall impact might be of implementing nature-based solutions. So unfortunately, the answer is context matters, but there is a lot of information for a lot of places in the world that can help inform those discussions and those planning processes. So we might be at time, but Kirsten, if you have anything quickly to add.
So in the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, we set up a long-term hydrology study to actually measure the benefits, the water benefits back into the catchments. So although there was the business case done for the feasibility of the work, of what we thought we were going to reclaim, having that actual in-field science has been really valuable to actually quantify that.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, our time for this quick Q&A is up right now, but we'll have more time during our panel discussion to bring forward some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A panel and in the chat. So, but at this point, I'd like to hand over to Daniel Sagai, who is a program officer at the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Please, thanks for joining us today, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Kari, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. This is Daniel Sagai from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. I'm very pleased to be with you to discuss the age of drought resilience, the work that is being performed by the Secretariat and the parties of the Secretariat of the UNCCD. So the title is Drought Challenges at the Global Level. Okay, first, let me say a few words on the drought hotspots. As you can imagine, and you can also witness in your day-to-day life, drought is now becoming harder and faster. It is not only in one or the other continent, it is a global issue. And what we have witnessed in the last 5 to 10 years is already a great picture that to show that drought is becoming very frequent and intense, and also in terms of the spatial extent, and the period is becoming, I think, longer. So there is some kind of a reality dictating the parties of the UNCCD to work on drought resilience in a more serious manner. And so drought at a glance, first, the scientific consensus is that humanity has already altered an estimated 70% of all land on Earth, and 20 to 40% is degraded. And we all know drought is deadly. There are some estimates from the last 3 to 4 decades. We have seen that the largest human losses in terms of the losses when we compare it to all other natural disasters, drought ranks #1 among all climate-related disasters. And drought is also costly. The economic loss due to drought have also increased multifold in billions, about $124 billion, the latest report of the Global Assessment Report of the UNDRR. And also it's devastating in terms of the frequency and the severity, about 30% increase since 2000. So the future is also not looking good. It's grim. Within the next few decades, about 130 countries will be also experiencing an increase in drought. So this is the future that we don't want, with the predictions of global warming to about even 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, drought losses could even increase 5 times higher than what they are today. So this is the reality that we are seeing, and the UNCCD parties are looking into issues of drought in a more serious manner. So the approach of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the parties of the UNCCD, about 196 countries plus the European Union, 197 parties, it's an integrated approach on a 3-pillar approach. Monitoring, early warning, and prediction is one approach. We need to look into what is going to happen in terms of predicting and forecasting drought, but also disseminating the risk analysis into the end beneficiaries of the user. So early warning for all initiative by the World Meteorological Organization, but led by the Secretary General of the UN and UNCCD in terms of the drought. The other one is risk and vulnerability assessment. We need to help countries to see who is going to be vulnerable and why, the drought risk profiling. And the other one is mitigation and response measures. So the actions and measures to mitigate drought risks. There is no one size fits all, and what is possible with one country is not possible with the other. So it's kind of a context-specific solution. And I'm just going to speak a bit about the UNCCD Drought Toolbox, which looks into this. So the shift in the paradigm is the main pillar that countries are working on, from reactive to proactive approach. As you can see in the dark red, the business as usual approach on drought has been always to react to drought risk when it strikes, like emergency relief, impact assessment, recovery, and restoration. This is where the story ends. But now we are trying to close the cycle by promoting proactive approach to drought, including this monitoring and early warning, what I mentioned, vulnerability assessment, and risk mitigation measures. So this is the cycle that about 70 countries are now adopting, and the UNCCD Drought Toolbox is also integrated into these 3 pillars. And countries, more than 70 countries, are part of this drought initiative, and they have put a lot of data, and you can Google it yourself, that there is a lot of nature-based solutions for drought that is also being maintained. So another thing that is countries are also looking into is an international drought resilience alliance. It is spearheaded by the governments of Spain and Senegal, and a number of UN agencies, countries, about 40 countries now, more than 30 UN and non-UN organizations. And I'm pleased to also share that the Nature Conservancy is one of the members and also steering committee members of this alliance. It has 4 pillars. It was first launched in 2022 at the COP27 climate COP in Egypt. 4 pillars. One is building political momentum for the agenda of drought, common framework to accelerate the action on drought resilience, knowledge sharing and experiences from countries to countries, from regions to regions, and also innovative finance for drought resilience. It is gaining momentum, and nature-based solutions for drought is also one of the key pillars. And as you can see, this is the 3rd pillar, and we are trying to look into a very strengthened collaboration with the TNC, where we had a joint policy brief launch at COP28 in Dubai just in December. So first, I just wanted to also say a few words before I close. One, the NCCD is a global vision for the voice for land with 197 parties of the UNCCD. It's adopted in June 1994, and it entered into force in 1996. It's the only legally binding framework set up to address the certification and the effects of drought. 197 parties, as I said, 196 countries plus the European Union. So land is the core business of these UNCCD parties. Our lives depend on land. Healthy land feeds shelters and clothes us. And as we know, up to 40% of the land worldwide has been degraded. Even the latest IPCC report brings it to about 59 to 60% of land is now degraded as a result of the consequence for climate, biodiversity, and livelihoods. So parties recognize this. And of course, up to 86% of the UNCCD parts are affected by the certification, land degradation, and drought of this 196, and this means also almost 170 countries. So half the world population on every continent is affected by land degradation. Today, 10% of the GDP is lost due to land degradation per year. 1 in 3 worldwide live and work in the dry lands. And in the decade 2027, drought affected about 1.5 billion and costs about 125 billion globally. So the drought and land degradation is affecting almost the humanity, 3/4 of the humanity. So global commitment to a land degradation neutral world has been already endorsed, and about 130 countries have now expressed political will to become a land degradation neutral country by 2030. And more than 70 countries have also worked on their national drought plans based on this principle of risk reduction. And the UNCCD Secretariat is working with this country. So the momentum is growing to also recognize nature-based solutions as one element of drought resilience. We had this drought smart land management, land-based opportunities for drought resilience, which we can probably discuss also during the question and answer session. But the momentum is there for countries to recognize land as a simple land, especially land rehabilitation, as a simple, inexpensive, and accessible to all means of combating drought and desertification. With this, I'm going to end my presentation, at least introducing the major achievements and also initiatives of the UNCCD. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that important perspective. I look forward to diving a little bit deeper during our panel session, but now we're going to hand over to Matthew McCartney from the International Water Management Institute to offer perspective from their organization about the role of nature in adaptation. Matthew is a research group leader in sustainable water infrastructure and ecosystems at IMI. Matthew?
Great, thank you very much, Carrie. Yes, so I'm just going to give a brief presentation where I'm going to argue for the need to conduct research to, as Nathan mentioned in his presentation, to improve the evidence base for nature-based solutions, and in particular to understand how they function and their role in the hydrological cycle. Okay. So as has been said, nature-based solutions, they offer many benefits for water management. We know that they can help with water supply, they can help with water quality, improving water quality, and importantly, in the context of this webinar, they're very important for disaster risk reduction. and they can help, as has already been discussed, help mitigate the impacts of floods and droughts by, as has been discussed, reducing the immediate physical impacts of those extreme events, but also importantly by helping people survive and recover in the aftermath of such events. Globally, we know that we need to invest in water infrastructure massively if we're going to achieve the SDGs. And we're talking about trillions of US dollars over the next 6 or 7 years to try and achieve the SDGs. Currently, worldwide annual investment in the water sector is about US 800 billion per year, of which less than 5% of that investment is actually invested in NbS and green, what some people call green infrastructure. And I argue that some of the constraints to this are, well, first of all, lack of awareness, difficulties of valuing and capitalizing on the co-benefits, some of the governance challenges around managing nature-based solutions, but also importantly, lack of knowledge and understanding, and particularly of the efficacy and the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. So we all know engineers, they want numbers. Those numbers are easily applied, can be determined relatively easily for typical grey infrastructure. But for nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, it's much more difficult. As has already been discussed, as Nathan mentioned several times in his presentation, the role of ecosystems in the hydrological cycle varies depending on the location within the catchment, whether it's in the upper watershed or the lower watershed. It can be dependent on the antecedent conditions. So, for example, some wetlands in southern Africa called dambos, which are thought, and they do have a big role in the local hydrology, but the role they play changes between the dry and the wet season. So in the dry season, at the end of the dry season, when they're dry, they absorb quite a lot of water and they reduce downstream flows and potentially reduce flooding. But then as the wet season progresses, they become saturated, and then they become areas where they generate runoff and in effect contribute to downstream flows and actually elevate flood peaks. So that's just one example where the conditions or the role of an ecosystem, a natural system, changes over time. The rainfall amount, its distribution and intensity can also impact on how ecosystems function. And of course, the biophysical characteristics of the catchment, the geology, the vegetation, etc., all have impacts on the way the ecosystems function and their role in the hydrological cycle, and therefore the benefits that they can bring. I just want to give a couple of examples. This is an example of a wetland located in South Africa in the Olifants catchment. It was in a sub-catchment of the Olifants called the Molapahitsi catchment. That Molapahitsi catchment was something like 1% of the total size of the Olifants catchment, but generates something like 16 or 17% of the dry season flow of the Olifants at the current time. And so people looked at that, they thought this is a big area of water. It's providing lots of water during the dry season, very important catchment. And within that catchment was a small area of wetland, particularly at the lower end of that catchment. And there was a thinking that this wetland, which was already being utilized in some places by local communities for agriculture, it needed to be protected because of its role in providing this dry season river flow. But in the study that we did, where we went and made some measurements and did some simple analysis, we demonstrated actually that it wasn't specifically the wetland which was producing that flow. It was actually the upper watershed, and the whole of the upper watershed, a much larger area, which had fairly natural vegetation, was not too disturbed, had not been too disturbed yet, and had a geology which promoted dry season river flow. So that was an example where it wasn't, protecting and conserving the wetland might be important, but more important for the water supply was actually to protect the whole of the upper catchment from potential future degradation. So understanding how these ecosystems work is very important. Another example where IMI's been working more recently is in the wetlands of Colombo. So Colombo is the metropolitan region of Colombo is built on a number of wetlands. There's approximately 20 kilometers squared of wetlands within a 200 kilometers squared catchment. That area was being lost due to encroachment and landfill, etc. And then about 2012, 2014, there was a very large flood. And the government recognized then that the wetlands were important for storing flood flows. And studies have been done to demonstrate that how much they can store for different return period floods. And yeah, potentially huge volumes of water can be stored in quite long-term or in very massive floods. And so now the wetlands are being protected. The government's trying to prevent encroachment and reduce encroachment and waste disposal, etc. And this is a good example of where the wetlands are actually working in conjunction with built infrastructure or grey infrastructure, because it's also linked in with pumps and canals, which are used to move water around and make sure that the storage is available during the wet season. And then finally, I want to briefly discuss another project we're working on where we're trying to demonstrate the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in water security in the MENA region. Here we're working with local communities in several countries, in Jordan, in Palestine, on the West Bank, in Egypt and in Lebanon, to demonstrate that different nature-based solutions can work in what is a very challenging and a very arid environment, both to promote dry season water availability, but also to reduce flooding because when rain does come, it often comes in huge amounts and causes flooding. We're working very closely, again, as Nathan said, and people have said, you need to work very closely with communities to make sure that these types of intervention actually are sustainable into the future. So in conclusion, I'll just say, yeah, as already mentioned, ecosystems are complex. Very often intuitive assumptions about the way they function are actually not correct. And therefore we have to be very careful about making assumptions about how they function and what the benefits they will bring are. Understanding the hydrological processes obviously is key to evaluating and quantifying, again, because like I said, engineers, they need numbers, but quantifying the impact of NbS in any specific context is very important. And research is therefore needed to provide this evidence base, which Nathan's mentioned already, for water planning and management decisions. And again, as Nathan said, NbS alone, they will rarely completely resolve water security issues. And we need to integrate them with grey infrastructure to make sure that we bring about results which are tangible and effective, not just currently, but also in the future when we want to manage what is going to be more intense extremes as a consequence of climate change. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a wonderful presentation and an additional perspective on nature-based solutions and adaptation. So I really appreciate you joining us today, as well as the other speakers. We're going to move now into our panel discussion. And let me start with a question for you, Matthew, since you just wrapped up speaking. I'm curious, in your presentation, you argued for more research to better understand the complex hydrologic functions of ecosystems for sustainable management. But that need, as Nathan talked about and as we talk about in our report, is to accelerate the uptake of nature-based solutions. So I'm curious about that conflict between more research and wanting to scale up quickly. So do you think research slows down uptake? Can we afford the luxury of more research when we have climate change impacts happening now and we have the need to integrate these kinds of solutions?
Yeah, I would argue that we don't have, it's not just a luxury, we absolutely have to do more research to better understand how these ecosystems function. These nature-based solutions are going to work both now and in the future. I mean, as you were talking about accelerating for climate change adaptation, we obviously need to understand how and what will work in the future, and that requires research. Of course, research doesn't mean doing nothing though, so we should still be open to the fact we need to make changes, and we need to introduce nature-based solutions as much as possible. What I think it is really important though is monitoring and effectively adaptive management. A bit like Kirsten mentioned in South Africa, where you're monitoring the impact of what you're doing to better understand how it is working. And then hopefully if you monitor and you're monitoring the right things, you can adapt your intervention in the future in ways to make sure that it is effective. And if necessary, you can link it with the grey infrastructure that you also need. So it's not really a luxury, it's something that must be done. And it's really, really important that we do invest in research and better understanding.
Great, thank you. Along the same lines, Nathan, I'm curious, in the work that we did for this report, what gaps did you identify through this work, including the sort of landscape assessment we did initially, and then also as we were working through the different portions of the research, that you would like to see more focus on or investment in the coming years in order to support the use of NbS for adaptation?
Yeah, I might give a little bit of response of Matthew with a bit of a science background, but I think part of the pieces that we were, this might sound strange, but we look forward to presenting in our report was discussions of the uncertainty pieces. And to Matthew's points, the uncertainty should not prevent us from employing and attempting to use nature-based solutions, given the multitude of co-benefits that also come along with them, including hazard mitigation potential. But that's forms part of an adaptive management process, collecting evidence and truly learning over time for a particular place and context whether these solutions actually are employable and can actually reach the targets that have been set out initially. So accepting and acknowledging that uncertainty is just a key part of it, and then monitoring and adapting over time is one of the pieces that we're happy to point out. I think another piece, I guess another gap that we did not really get into for various reasons, including limitations on data availability, but is the impact of nature-based solutions, not on the catastrophic side of impacts, so not just 100-year flood events, but flood events with more frequent recurrence intervals or smaller scale flood events where nature-based solutions are in many cases might be more amenable or have more potential relative to the impact of that event. And so I think that's an important research space, is not just looking at these large scale impacts, but also looking at more frequent, less intense events that are also going to change over time as a result of climate change.
Great, thank you. And then I see there's quite a few questions in the chat, so feel free to keep those coming from the audience, and the panelists have also answered some of those within that Q&A function, so feel free to keep adding there. Kirsten, I'm curious, what has been most surprising or a really powerful insight that you've had since starting your work on the Greater Cape Town Water Fund that you think might be relevant for the discussion we're having here today?
So we have mentioned the science and the monitoring evaluation, but that has really been critical for the success of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. And I think that's been the defining factor from previous restoration efforts and catchments to have this real-time monitoring, also being able to capture the information of different partners working in the same space to coordinate and plan and adapt as we go. And we also made use of, new digital systems like Tableau to have a public-facing interface for transparency, for everyone to see who's investing where and what they're doing. And that has really been, for me personally, it's quite mind-blowing. I think it's fantastic. But I think it also allows externals to see what you're doing and those working in the landscape to coordinate and plan in a strategic, constructive way. Great,
thank you. Thank you, that's really helpful. And any of the other panelists, feel free to jump in to respond to the responses of all of our panelists here. But I'm curious, Daniel, what trends are you seeing in how different actors view nature as part of the drought resilience story? Has this changed over the last couple of years, and how do you see this in terms of how people are viewing that potential for nature to be part of the story?
Thank you very much, Kari, for this very interesting question. The trend is very, very promising. First of all, for the first time, the UNCCD parties recognizes the nature-based solutions for drought and also land degradation at COP15 in May 2022. This was a big achievement. And also, I think there is a lot more collaboration around drought resilience, especially parties. The last 2 to 3 conference of parties have been dominated by the agenda of drought resilience and what can be done. And they established an intergovernmental working group on drought that brings together about 27 members. I think they have been working from 2019, the first phase, until 2022, the first report. And then they re-established this intergovernmental working group on drought. And they are still working. And we are expecting a very interesting COP decision that also brings the nature-based solutions for drought in Saudi Arabia in December 2024, this year. There will be a conference of parties, and we are very much expecting the outcomes of this intergovernmental working group will be presented, and parties are going to be having a very strong and interesting decision, sustainable decision. There is some momentum around drought resilience partnership. As I have mentioned, the International Drought Resilience Alliance now is being followed by around 40 countries and more than 30 UN organizations, non-UN organizations. So I think the momentum is there. What we need is to really bring to also use this momentum, making sure that drought is not a sector, it is a connector, and nature is going to help us connect all these actors, I think, together. So we are very much hopeful about this collaboration coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really exciting. And I saw a lot of cheers in the reactions to those updates. So I think a lot of people are excited about that progress. So my next question are for any of the panelists, but the question came from one of our audience members directed at Nathan and Kirsten around what role that communities can play in the successful implementation and maintenance of NbS for drought and flood management. So I open this up to Nathan and Kirsten, but also to Matthew and Daniel to answer to this question.
So with the caveat that I am a biophysical scientist, so not the strongest in the social sciences, but having said that, I think communities are absolutely critical throughout the so-called value chain of nature-based solutions, from the planning and implementation side of the work, but even also as well as informing perceptions, understanding of changing climate patterns. This is a critical additional and fundamental source of information around how we expect climate changes to actually manifest on the landscape, and understanding communities' perceptions of those risks and how their own natural resources, how their interactions with the landscapes have changed over time is absolutely critical to even putting in place planning for adaptation, including nature-based solutions. And then identifying and considering which nature-based solutions would be actually applicable and most readily adapted and utilizable by these communities is an important piece for the communities that they have the knowledge that is essential and necessary to actually put together these portfolios and plannings. And so doing sort of these global and kind of Western technocratic exercises around planning and modeling nature-based solutions is really very much only part of the solution set. And the other pieces around understanding climate risk and how communities are actually being impacted, what solutions are actually applicable and relevant for them, and which ones have most likely to have the kind of greatest fortitude in terms of sustaining communities through the impacts of climate change is absolutely essential to integrate and bring in perspectives and really empowerment of local communities. So having said that, from my global position as a biophysical scientist, Kirsten will have a more informed response.
So I'll just give a very specific example within the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. For me, the communities we directly benefiting through the work is, I think, where the biggest impact is in terms of making a difference in individual lives, but these are the people that are actually getting the work done. And I think the skills development that the Greater Cape Town Water Fund has done to develop their ability to be confident in the work that they're doing, but also the importance of their role, how they identify themselves in that role is really important. So when I speak to the individuals in the field, I'm always amazed, through this process, they've walked a journey with the Water Fund. And when you speak to them, it's not just clearing aliens, it's making water for Cape Town. And that's quite important, how they identify themselves as the solution.
Wonderful. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Kristen. We're running up on top of time. I see Matthew, you want to jump in, and Matthew, just point to one of the questions in the chat around whether NbS are being held to a different performance standards relative to gray engineered solutions because they're seen as more innovative implementation. That's a big question. I think what we'll do after the webinar is try to answer some of the questions that have come up as we share out about the webinar. So because we're running out of time, but I do want to give a moment for each of the panelists, if they wish, to give closing remarks, and starting with Matthew, either related to the question that just came up or anything else you'd like to say. Thank you.
No, I was just going to talk about the community involvement. I mean, a lot of the work, I think communities are absolutely essential to making nature-based solutions work. We're talking about ecosystems and ecosystem management across landscapes, and you can't do that without community buy-in. And some work that IMI's done here in Colombo, we work with communities, getting them to do participatory video to show us what they think were important things they were doing to help manage the wetlands, and then trying to and using those participatory videos to take to government ministers and other stakeholders to show that the community do value the wetlands and demonstrate what they themselves think they're contributing in terms of management, and then trying to align that with government policy. So I think that was one way that you can bring communities in. It's just one example, and of course, yeah, part of these participatory approaches are really essential.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll leave it there because I think we're running out of time. I don't want to take
Thank you. We are running out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I was hoping to get some closing remarks from everybody, but I think we've just got 1 minute left. So we will, look at all the questions that came in. There were some really fantastic questions. We could spend several hours talking with you all about this topic, but I think we'll move to the final slide here, just as a thank you to everybody. I just want to say thank you all, especially the speakers who joined us today. It was really powerful to hear your perspectives. Thank you, Nathan, Kirsten, Daniel, and Matthew. And thank you all for attending, for taking the time to spend with us this morning, this evening. And I just wanted to share really quickly some really quick announcements around our work. We've shared the link for the report in the chat, and I really want to encourage you to look at the report. As Nathan mentioned, there's a lot more detail in there, and we welcome you to reach out to us with any questions or wanting to discuss partnering any of this future work on nature and water-related adaptation. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar, just giving a big thanks to all of you who joined today. We look forward to continuing to collaborate on building resilient watersheds and helping people and nature adapt to climate change. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you so much.